People keep asking if I'm back, and I haven't really had an answer. But now, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right, folks. Custom cards are finally back. Should be moving into a fairly regular schedule for these moving forward. And if you forgot, this time around, we're taking a look here at 10 mana spells. Now, when I requested 10 mana spells, little did I know that soon after, a card like Kael'Thas would be revealed, and we would all suddenly realize the ease of playing really expensive spells. So keep in mind, many of these cards were designed in a pre-Kael'Thas environment, and in some cases, they could be a little problematic with Kael'Thas, but that's not the fault of the designers, because Kael'Thas hadn't yet existed in their minds, and some of these I think would still be just fine. That said, here we're starting off with Rage of Neltharion from Creed. It's a 10 mana warrior spell. It silences and destroys all minions, so that's basically just Plague of Death, very simply a priest card here. But the really cool part about this card is that it then splits the battlefield in half. And this is really a reference to Deathwing in the Cataclysm expansion of World of Warcraft. He kind of tore this big cataclysm, this rift in the entire planet, basically, at least the major continents. And thankfully, Creed here has mocked up what this might look like, and literally just a giant rift in the middle of the battlefield. And what that means functionally is that anything on one side would not be able to interact with anything on the other. Essentially, Hearthstone would move into a game with two different lanes. So a taunt minion on the left wouldn't protect from a minion on the right. The minion on the right could still hit face, ignoring the taunt, etc. Minions couldn't trade across the rift, etc. I guess heroes, since they're in the middle, would still be able to affect both sides via spells and like weapon attacks, but any minions specifically are limited to their half, which is a really cool idea, and it's something I've seen people suggest a few times, but rarely executed this well visually, and I think this card does set that up really well. So if there's some reason your warrior deck is able to use that in an advantageous way, or it's just something you think could really limit your opponent, I can't even really imagine all the strategic implications like this, so please share your ideas for how this would possibly help you build a deck or define a strategy around it. But I just think things like this are really cool in a digital card game space where we can break the game, we can change the rules. Blizzard has done that in small doses in the past. Something like this would be really big and really fun, and would add a totally new layer of strategy to the game, which I'm always up for those sorts of things. So super flavorful, really fun idea, a little bit reflective of Plague of Death, certainly, but I think this extra element really takes this one over the top. I'd love to see a card like this. Moving on here to Revelation from A Mage Old as Dirt, a 10 mana priest spell here that would very simply just discover you 10 cards. And I love just like big symmetrical cards like this, 10 mana, discover 10 cards. That's just enormous effect, the totality of being able to fill your entire hand. That's really, really cool. And you might say, well, that's a little bit like Archivist Elysiana. She functionally discovers you 10 total cards and shuffles them into your deck. Why would you run Revelation over something like Elysiana? Because, of course, sometimes cards in hand are better than cards in deck. If you're not worried about fatigue protection, but instead just generating a lot of value that you can play faster and get yourself some choices for a future turn, Revelation would allow you to do that. So it's great, you know, top decking it into an empty hand. You might have to waste your entire turn for tempo, but if Priest can stay defensive enough and recover enough, that's not always a problem. And then you just get to pick what you want, right? And of course, with the changes to Discover not too long ago, but a while ago nonetheless, where you're not biased towards getting class cards, you're going to get some bad choices here in your Discover pool, some random neutral stuff you don't care about, but you're also going to get great class cards as well. And you're probably going to end up with a halfway decent hand that's at least able to keep you moving through the game. And of course, with a card like Kael'Thas, this would be really cool to play, right? Like Kael'Thas could be this reload, you play a couple cheap spells, you refill your hand, maybe get even more cheap spells, shenanigans for later. So all in all, it just feels like this really cool big priest idea. It feels and looks right. It sounds great from a name standpoint, and I just love these sorts of effects. Moving on here to Cackle of Hyenas from Abo Fahad. This is a hunter spell. We actually did get a 10 mana hunter spell in the latest expansion, which is pretty cool with Grand Slam. But this version's a little different. It would summon you 5 scavenging hyenas and then give those hyenas rush, which is just such a cool idea, right? So scavenging hyena, of course, the 2/2 get stronger as other friendly beasts die, which means since you have 5 of those, they're each going to feed into each other when you trade them in. So depending on the board state, you can get some really interesting trades, and you'd have to do a little bit of solving along the way. Like, I'm going to trade in this 2/2, then I have a 4/3. I'm going to trade in this 4/3, then I got a 6/4. I'm going to trade in this 6/4, then I got an 8/5. Maybe the 8/5 chills on board with the other 8/5, and you've traded a little, and you've built yourself some really nasty resources late in the game. Maybe you trade in 4. Maybe you have to trade in all 5 as kind of a board clear, a pseudo twisting nether. Maybe one sticks around with a couple health. Maybe you don't trade it in, you just create a really big problem for your opponent, or maybe you already had minions on board to support this and start trading in, and you've got a bunch of big hyenas. There's a handful of different scenarios, but all in all, I like that this requires you to kind of think on the fly, requires adjustments from both you and your opponent. It's a big kind of swingy play that references what Hunter does, and a card that has certainly been a big part of Hunter in the past. So from a flavor and feel standpoint, this card delivers a lot of that Hunter fantasy, and I think it'd be a really, really fun one to figure out and play with. Moving on here, we've got a card from Minivat 22 for Paladin. It's called The Chosen One. 10 mana spell, of course, and it allows you to choose a minion and then destroy all minions except the one that you've chosen. So particularly in light of Kael'Thas, I think this card's really cool. It could be a Kael'Thas on-board clear, where you choose your Kael'Thas and you destroy everything else, because you could easily play this with Kael'Thas with a couple secrets, for instance, into the Chosen One and then continue to chain off your Kael'Thas while swinging a board. That's amazing that this kind of accidentally lined up with Kael'Thas so well. Beyond that, even in a non-Kael'Thas world, I think this could still be a big board clear for Paladin. It's kind of like Brawl in a way, right? But really expensive, of course, except you get to choose what wins the Brawl. Now, unlike Brawl that's cheap and you can sometimes play a minion into, you couldn't, for instance, hero power into this for Paladin. But if you had a minion lingering around, or if your opponent has like a 1/1 and a bunch of 8/8s, you're going to choose that 1/1, and that will serve as a good enough sort of twisting nether or board clear bundled into a single card. And then, of course, if you happen to have something big and awesome you want to protect on board, and you were a little bit ahead and your opponent played a bunch of 5/5s or something to get in the way, just protect your minion, clear out all that other stuff, keep hammer in face with that big dragon or big Tyrion or whatever it is you got on board that you want to protect. So I just love this idea of picking the Chosen One. It does feel very Paladin-esque, has some cool Kael'Thas implications, and the artwork here is just amazing. So all in all, a lot about this card works very well. Next up here, we've got Final Gambit from Dat Mage Doe for Warlock. Love the artwork on this one, and it reads, both players draw the rest of their deck. So you're making one Final Gambit here, one last chance to draw all the stuff you need, and of course, you're very likely to burn a ton of cards, much like we saw with Myra's Unstable Element in the past, but then also, you're forcing your opponent to do the same. So you're creating this fatigue lockstep, basically. You're each going to fatigue at the exact same rate moving forward. So do you have a way to leverage those final cards better than your opponent? Now, I will be honest, a card like this makes me really, really nervous. This feels like it could just create these crazy win states, particularly with any kind of shuffle card. Just run this with Archivist Elysiana or something else to help refill your deck, and maybe you've got some kind of problematic win condition. That's very obvious to me. But I love this idea of Warlock as being the kind of card draw class, and just like literally everybody, give me all the cards. I'm drawing all the cards, right? Me, you both, we're all drawing a ton of cards and just see what happens, right? See what sticks. And of course, that could be risky if your opponent's just ahead on board. You've spent 10 mana, you've wasted like an entire turn and tons of tempo to set up this condition. So if they're able to outplay you from that state, like you've given them kind of a 10 mana advantage in this symmetrical fatigue state, and that might just cost you the game. Like it'd be really hard to win. We've seen similar sorts of things with Void Contract in the past, so this just ups the ante even further. Void Contract obviously was terrible. It didn't work. I fear this could fall into the same state, even though it could also maybe be broken in some ways too. But I like cards like that put it all on the line. I mean, clearly this is not going to be in the game, so we can kind of play around with these ideas. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think this would be completely broken and help Warlock win all the time? Or would this be too big of a sacrifice, even though you're putting your opponent on fatigue? Would they still be able to kind of outpace you because you wasted so much mana? I want to hear your takes there. But I just love this idea, even if it wouldn't really fit in reality, if it'd be too risky, too big, too scary. It's a really, really fun exploration of the mechanic anyway. Great name and cool art. So a pretty nifty custom card nonetheless. Speaking of cards with some finality, we've got another one here from Reese's Pieces. By the way, my favorite candy, I think. It's Flark's Last Laugh. And this one would trigger all death rattles in your deck, and then it would destroy your deck. So we've had these kind of death rattle synergy cards in Hunter in the past, and we've still got some stuff happening even today with things like Leper Gnomes making their way into some face Hunter decks. And clearly, this could be used that way as a huge burst damage card where you put like a couple Leper Gnomes and whatever that other Kobold Leper Gnome card whose name I can never remember is, something to do with sand. Put those in your deck, and this could like burst your opponent for, 2 from a Leper Gnome each. That's 4. Another 6 from those Kobold Leper Gnomes. And it's like, boom, that's a 10 damage burst for 10 mana. It's kind of like an unavoidable Pyroblast. Now, of course, that doesn't always work, right? Because those aren't always going to be in your deck. Sometimes you want to draw those and play those, so it might be less kind of burst or direct damage, particularly depending on the standard format rotation, as the Kobold card would eventually rotate out. Now, beyond that, of course, there are lots of other death rattle effects too. You've got things like Augmented Porcupine, which could also deal direct damage to your opponent's face, or at least help clear minions. Lots of summon effects, all the typical Savannah High main style stuff to get you some 2/2s or even bigger minions. So clearly, when this goes off, it's going to do something crazy. It's probably going to build you a gigantic board. It could potentially clear much of your opponent's board and deal lots and lots of face damage. So is that totally broken? Maybe. Perhaps even probably. But I do think the fact that that it just wipes your deck, that your entire deck is gone, that helps balance that risk reward a little bit again. Much like our previous card, this one worries me a lot because of all the ways it could go crazy. But, if you go into fatigue, if you already are a Hunter with a small hand, you've made it to turn 10, Hunter doesn't generally put a lot of resources in hand. This is it. This is really your last laugh, which does make this a very fitting name. And it feels like if your opponent just recovers, you're completely out of the game, right? So you take this kind of crazy shot. Can you get there? If you're an aggro deck that's putting that like 10 damage in lethal range, how are you running a 10 mana spell? You've got to draw this as a one-of in your deck. You can't draw all your death rattles first. I think there are maybe enough checks and balances on this one that it wouldn't actually be broken, which would make it this really, really fun big button to push and just see how much craziness can unfold. So again, share your thoughts on this. If it's totally crazy, let me know. I think a lot of you will say it's totally crazy. Many of you will be right. But I just love this idea of hitting that big button, blowing everything up, and just seeing what happens. That feels like Flark. It feels like Hunter. And I think maybe it wouldn't really be all that good, but it could also just be totally, totally insane. Moving on here to I Will Not Be Denied from Overly Green Turtle. We got another Warlock card here, and it's a discard synergy card. Of course, I love those. This one will summon all minions that you discarded this game. So functionally, up to 7 minions would be summoned here as a really nice big board reload. And in particular right now, with the way we can discard high-cost minions through things like Expired Merchant, then you could actually get a pretty big board of big stuff, and maybe even like sticky death rattle-y stuff too, if you were able to discard the right sorts of things, like Enhanced Dreadlords, for instance. You could build yourself a really big, nasty board, and you could keep discarding the same high-cost targets over and over again. So this would be that kind of like N'Zoth-style 10-mana reload where you build a giant board. It is a legendary spell, of course, so it's only a one-of, but you could still use this as that reload tool. And I think that'd be great. It would be another payoff card essentially for discard, which historically the payoff cards in discard haven't quite been big enough. I know wild format's finally getting some cool stuff going, but in standard format, each little kind of slice of the discard package was never enough. When you bundle them all together in wild, makes sense. So a card like this would help give it that extra oomph, and Warlock has thrived in the past having those multiple reloads, right? The Blood Reaver Gul'dan. Nowadays we have things like Galakron that gives you a pretty big board. Even Cannon with that Ebonlock can do the same. So I do feel like this would fit into that Warlock world very nicely. Would be that big payoff for the current style of discard where it's your highest cost cards. So I love this style of card. I want discard Warlock to work always. And I think this one would be a really fun way to play with that and build your deck around and have that key centerpiece card you really needed to make things work. Next up here, we have Spite of the Wilds from A Mage Old as Dirt, a 10-mana druid spell. And this allows you to choose a minion and summon 5 random beasts to attack it. So this is basically like bees, but with big random beasts instead of merely 1/1s. And I think that's a really, really cool way to take a mechanic we've already seen and basically push it to the max and see how big and cool it could get. So I think the numbers here are perfectly right. Like 5 random beasts sounds like the right amount to me, because sometimes you're going to get like 3 2s, you know, and you're not going to be that excited, but you could also get 8 king crushes and things could go absolutely nuts, right? So you have to have some kind of balance. You can't do like a full 7. 5 could even maybe be a little high, arguably, but I think it's actually the right number. There's a lot of low-cost beasts, especially. Now, so this could basically serve as kind of like a targeted in a Grand Slam, or, you know, a single board removal that leaves you behind a pretty decent board. It's a big like a swing turn where you clear something and summon some stuff. You could even use this on your own minions as well. If you just had a 1/1 and you wanted to summon a board, if you were like ahead in the game, you could still use it as a board builder, even not requiring you to kill something of your opponents. Now, all that said, this is one of those cards that I think would have been just amazing pre-Kael'Thas, but now that we know that like Kael'Thas spell druid is a thing, this card's probably just way too good. It would be another way for the Kael'Thas swing turn to go crazy. They already have the glowfly swarms and the gift of the wilds to build these giant boards very, very affordably with Kael'Thas. This would allow them to also kill something in the meantime and still build a big board. So this is admittedly probably really, really broken right now in Hearthstone, just because we've seen that. But I can't hold that against Mage, again, because these were designed pre-Kael'Thas. And I think this would have been such a great card without Kael'Thas that I'm going to include it anyway. I just think it's a really, really fun, nifty design, and a lot of things about it are right. So I like this card a ton. Broken now, but really, really cool nonetheless. Save this one for when Kael'Thas rotates to Wild. Next up here, we have Dungeon Raid from Dlofferferg. This one's a big paladin spell, and it reads recruit a minion, and then if it costs 5 or more, cast this again. And we've had this kind of dual big paladin thing lingering in Hearthstone for a while. It's like basically big paladin, big minion paladin, where you're summoning all these giant things. That's never quite gotten there from a popularity or competitiveness standpoint. There's been some okay fringe decks, but never made it over the hump. And I think a card like this could really help that style of play rather nicely, where you have multiple big payoffs and you just generate a giant board a couple times off of your Dungeon Raid and perhaps a few other support cards along the way. And I really want to play that kind of deck. I love big minions. I love getting these giant unkillable boards where you just stamp out your opponent. This would be a great tool with a lot of taunts to be the kind of final killing blow against an aggro deck. Or if you're playing a control deck, it might just be able to overwhelm them with death rattle resources and value. Now, of course, this does create some kind of fatigue issues, I guess, right? Where you're pulling all these cards out of your deck, because these are recruited, not copies, they're recruited minions. They do actually come out of your deck. So how do you fix that problem? I don't know exactly, but in a Kael'Thas world, this could be pretty crazy as well, right? Cheat it out a little sooner, build a giant Kael'Thas board. So all in all, I just like how it captures that idea from Paladin, where we've got these big minions we want to get into play. It's hard to do that in Paladin right now. A card like this could almost arguably be even cheaper, I think, but it's certainly fine at 10 mana, and I like that it reinforces that archetype rather nicely. And then finally here, one last card. It's Otherworldly Legion, also from Dlofferferg. It's a priest spell, and it reads, add 5 random priest minions to your hand and summon any that wouldn't fit. And this is a really cool idea, right? Because it features Princess Talanji. We already know Talanji is a card that would summon minions from your hand if they didn't start there. This kind of takes that mechanic and stretches it into a different direction. And I think it's a really cool idea where you're rewarding hand size in Priest by turning it into essentially extra tempo on board. So, for instance, if you play a lot of Galakron Priest, you can get in these scenarios where you just have a ton of resources in hand. Your button keeps adding minions to your hand because you're generating one off of the hero power. You just, using things like Renew to add spells to your hand. You're just constantly cycling into new stuff, Thought Steals, adding cards into your hand. You have a full hand, and sometimes it's hard to turn that into anything really meaningful because you're just playing like 1 minion at a time, maybe 2. You can't really ever swing the game back in your favor. Otherworldly Legion could allow you to do that because you're going to dump your hand full of stuff. If you have 9 cards in hand, boom, you're going to summon 4 priest minions, get yourself a pretty nice board load, which is fantastic. And then beyond that, of course, this can actually just be a resource generator if you're out of stuff. So You randomly generate this off of something you really need tools in hand to keep a game stretched on, to keep it going and going and going. This adds 5 cards to your hand. You get some minions to play, and you're good to go for future turns as long as you're able to spend 10 mana on a card like that, which could be hard, but there are game states and scenarios where that's certainly possible. So I like that it has that kind of dual flexibility. Save it up to either build a board. If you don't have the cards in hand, you get resources. So it does both things rather well, but at certainly some cost here of efficiency and mana. But a really fun idea of taking Talanji into a different direction and utilizing priests, sometimes big hands, and rewarding a sort of a hand deck in a different way than we've seen. Usually it's converted to stats on board or mana efficiency, but this is just raw minions being dumped into play, which I think is pretty cool. And there you have it, folks. That's it for the latest custom card review. It feels good to be talking about new cards again. That said, I'm sure you're curious how to submit for next time. Well, there are some details in the description below. There's a link down there. And your theme for this time is, of course, going to be Demon Hunter. I want you to make me a Demon Hunter card. It can be anything you want, a weapon, a spell, a minion, a legendary card, a quest if you want. That sounds pretty cool. Just make something based on Demon Hunter, the new class in Hearthstone, and we haven't explored that space yet, so there should be a lot of cool ideas floating around. Really looking forward to those. Again, the details are in the description. Until then, of course, feel free to share your thoughts on these cards. Which ones did you like? Which ones did you hate? Which ones are broken? Which ones had the coolest ideas, the best art, the best names, etc. Don't forget, I still like to focus a little bit more on flavor than perfect balance. So feel free to share your thoughts on both, but I'm going to focus more on the themes, the ideas, the fun of the card in many cases. That said, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more of these videos, and until next time, game on.